I mentioned last week or the week before that I wanted to share this slide about the Declaration of Independence, especially as a framer here for the importance of what I call biological integrity. My project is biointegrity.net. This is the first sentence of the United States Declaration of Independence, written on January 4th, read to the Continental Congress on January 4th, or July 4th, sorry, July 1st, July 4th, and then signed about a month later into existence. What's incredible about this is that it literally states that when the time has come for, obviously we all know this story, but for the people in America to dissolve their political bands with the nation over on the other side of the Atlantic. And that it's time for them to become their own nation, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. This is literally the third phrase of this sentence, and what it's saying to me is that before you can have a nation, you have to function within the confines of the laws of nature and the creator of nature, whatever you ascribe that force to be. And we'll come back to some of these ideas about nature's laws and nature's creator in a moment. But we literally see, and it feels very ironic today because the culture is so far away from this, but we literally see in the first sentence of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, clear identification by Thomas Jefferson that before you can become a nation, you have to function within the confines of the biosphere, within the confines of what biological integrity allows. That's a huge area, it'd be fun to talk about, but we don't have time today. Here begins our somewhat lengthy review that we have been talking about the history of life. These are sort of the four big tent posts of that discussion, that life began around 4 billion years ago, that it's a story of micro to macro. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, you see animals in a green box and plants. Everything else in that upper right-hand corner in the tree of life there is microbial. And if you look down in the lower left-hand quarter of this slide, you see that humanity is a little fringe hair on the outcropping of the tree of life mapping here. There are multiple mappings of the tree of life, and they all have different numbers of species in them. But the point here is that we're not at the core of what makes life possible on Earth. We are a beneficiary. So as the Native Americans I've checked this with some people, so my apologies if it sounds a little too general, but as Native American culture tends to say, you can take people out of the system of life and the system of life will be fine. But if you take the system of life away, what do you have for people? And this is what we've accidentally done in full-scale form in the last few decades. The idea of the integrity of life.
Again, they have all the characteristics of the previous groups we talked about, the fish and the amphibians, but they also have these other characteristics. They have a waterproof skin, which, remember, the previous species did not necessarily have waterproof skins, although fish, for the most part, do. And it's a skin covered with scales or waterproof covering. They're cold-blooded. Every one of the animals we've talked about to this point is cold-blooded, which means their temperature will adjust to be similar to the temperature in their environment. So let's talk a little bit about an ecology issue there. In cold-blooded organisms, aquatic organisms, they will not hibernate like a mammal might do, a bear or so on. However, they will get very, very slow in their metabolisms as the water cools. They don't consume much food. They don't respire much, so they don't inhale and exhale nearly as much. They don't grow. They don't go through their reproductive cycle. They are very stationary, sedentary. And because of that, they become highly susceptible to becoming victims of predation. Now, back to reptiles. Reptiles have hard-shelled eggs. This is the first group that we've had that's had hard-shelled eggs. that are waterproof. And we're starting to see a more advanced kind of an egg, and they have force-chambered hearts. So a lot of them are aquatic, but there's also a lot of freshwater species. So I haven't seen the specific breakdown there, but obviously turtles are aquatic, and there are freshwater. There are both marine and freshwater, as well as terrestrial, non-aquatic. I don't know why we have a picture of a frog here. That's an amphibian. There are aquatic snakes that at least spend some of their lives or most of their lives in the water. Not as important in freshwater as they are in marine systems. However, we've talked about this in the aquatic ecology and ecological aquaculture before. Some of the bigger frogs, like bullfrogs, can actually be a food source for humans. And so they have some ecological agriculture prominence. So we've gone through life cycles so far of all the animals, and we're going to continue that through the vertebrates. We're probably going to go back and talk about invertebrates in a little different section. So again, they start with eggs. Remember, we said the eggs are hard-shelled. They actually break open like you could picture a chicken egg, and the youngs come out of them. They don't metamorphose. They'll look very much as young hatchlings, baby turtles, like an adult does, like again, a mammal would typically do in many cases.
Got started when I was in college, and I met a football player, and I was a big sports fan. I'm sure a lot of us out there were. Ex-football player, and he recruited me to go into the insurance business. So I was barely 21 years old. In fact, on my 21st birthday, I think I've told you this story, haven't I, Wayne? I was in Ohio, and at that time in Ohio, the only place you could take the test to become an insurance agent was in Columbus, and I was in Dayton, Ohio, which was a little over an hour away from Columbus. So on my 21st birthday, which is the earliest you could actually qualify for an insurance license, I was in my car going to Columbus to take the test, and fortunately I passed and went into the life insurance business. Well, I don't know if any of you have been in the life insurance business, but there's nothing more difficult to do that I know of than selling life insurance, particularly when you're 21 years old and you're trying to convince people that they should be buying something to protect family and friends. And I'm still in college. I'm not even out yet. So long story short, I did have a little bit of success, but nothing to the extent that I was hoping for, until I discovered employee benefits and realized that, and this is another theme, realizations of where the market is and how I could take advantage of the market kind of fit into this theme, was that I realized that if a business was spending money on something, they had to spend the money. It was no longer am I going to do it, it's who am I going to do it with. So one of the big hurdles that I had to overcome was getting people to say yes. It wasn't about saying yes to will I do it or not, it was yes to me. So I went to work for an insurance company as a employee benefits rep, and I had to go back to Connecticut and New Jersey to get my career started in that business. And again, keeping with the theme, I realized that there is a continuum of processes in every business, and positioning yourself in the right part of the continuum is something that people need to understand and do so that they can be as successful as they can with the skill sets that they have. So again, I'm in this business. I'm realizing that the control part of it isn't the guys who work for the insurance companies, although that's changed. When I was in it, there were thousands of insurance companies. Now there's about 5, so it's a little different story. But then, now we're going back quite a few years, the control was in the consultant broker that dealt with the customer that was making the purchase. And most of the purchasers were very unsophisticated in this area. And honestly, at that time, this business was in its embryonic stages. So I decided that I wanted to switch from being on the insurance side and to be on the consultant side. And I also didn't want to be on the East Coast anymore. I wanted to be in San Francisco. So I quit that job. I went to San Francisco, went to work for a regional insurance broker that at the time was big enough to be dealing with companies like the Fairmont Hotel, and got my feet wet on the broker side. Now recognize that this is 1973. I'm in San Francisco, and Silicon Valley had yet to be discovered, but it wasn't going to be very far down the road before it did start to take off.
When he was 3, he was on an awful lot of steroids and antibiotics for asthma, and it used to kill me. He was on so many drugs for such a small child. So when they wanted to put him on a nebulizer, this big, huge thing, I just kind of went, can I just not for a minute? So I went the homeopathic route, and I've never looked back, and it worked for us. And my son doesn't have asthma, and he hadn't within a few months. So then I realized, wow, this stuff really works. So I went, now I do cigarettes also using EFT, emotional freedom technique, and I loved my cigarettes. They were something I held on to very tightly. There again, when that worked for me, there again I could see how I could. I went off point again, didn't I? Sorry. So I suppose that was my journey from law, life and my path. And my work ended and dried up with the recession and that. And then I had my children, and it was a natural sort of progression into their health and, and also their emotional health.
Yeah, kids kind of do that. They kind of become the center focus of your life at that point, obviously. Yes. And I've got three sons myself, and now a couple grandchildren. So it's an amazing, yes. The whole venture or journey is amazing with a family, and what it does and how it changes is exciting in itself. Okay, so now you get into this area of, is healing the proper term? Is that what you do? You help people heal, or is it more about the emotions and helping them to become better people, or maybe the purpose of what they're here for?
Yeah, and I also like to think I always say when I'm teaching my workshops that it's empowering people to. I don't heal anybody, as we know. I would assist somebody. Yes, I would. I would give them tools. I think everything I do is tools to help them to do the work themselves. And that's the work I do with children. It's about empowering children to realize they have a choice. But yes, I suppose when someone comes to me, I am a therapist in that area where when I do my Reiki on someone, I'm holding a very high vibration with their highest intention in my head. So, if they come to me for something, I have the intention that whatever they need to dissolve will dissolve, but we don't have, like, if they have a sore back, they may need to, it might manifest as a sore back, but they may have issues that need to be dealt with. So they may feel a pain in their head during the session, that something may need to shift in another area, and then the pain in the back may go.
Sure.
Did I answer that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
I do talk a lot, so you need to hold me in every now and again.
No, that's fine. You're doing great. Just for those of you that may not know, I didn't really even say, but at the beginning of our lab here today, that Dolores is actually in Ireland, and so when she talked about the recession and some of the things that she was going through in her personal life, it obviously was directly related to Ireland there. So that might have been I just wanted to throw that in so people knew where you're from. Okay, so let's get to this emotional freedom technique that you do. Now, is it safe to say, with what I know about that this is because there was a big world summit called tapping?
Yeah.
Is it the same thing? Is that one and the same, or are they similar? Or explain a little bit about what EFT is.
Sure, yes. EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Technique. So basically, if you have, like most things that most ailments we have, whether it be chronic pain, whether it be an addiction to cigarettes or whatever, there's nearly always an emotional aspect attached to things.
The cellular system is the active policeman on patrol, as you would have it, that can pick up any cell that mutates into a different looking individual. In other words, they have different antigens, different receptors on their cell membrane that would tend to fool a cell that hadn't been programmed properly to identify it. And then the CD4 secretes cytokines, interleukins, and interferons specific to the identified cell, so that the CD8 cell, the killer or cytotoxic cell, can take it out of the system. And it also identifies with specificity the natural killer cells, which are roaming the system and are affected by various cytokines as well to identify these different cells. So in a nutshell, that's how the cell-mediated system side of the adaptive immune system works. So the total adaptive system with the beta lymphocytes and the T cells, the T cell lymphocytes, and that whole complement and the natural killer cells is really the heart of the discussion tonight.
Okay, great. And then what we have for you tonight, Stephanie, if you can hear me and cue it up, we have just a short 2.5-minute video that kind of talks about this process. So I'm going to turn it back over to my screen, back over to Stephanie, or actually Stephanie, I think you've already taken it. And if you could, there you go.
This basically is showing an antigen-presenting cell. That's a macrophage, and the cell inside is a bacteria or a cancer cell.
Activation of the immune response to antigen enters the body. Macrophages that encounter the pathogen ingest, process, and display the antigen fragments on their cell surfaces. Macrophages with antigen fragments displayed on their surfaces are called antigen-presenting cells. An antigen-presenting macrophage interacts with a T helper cell that can recognize the same antigen. During the interaction, the macrophage releases the chemical alarm receptor called interleukin-1, which stimulates the T helper cell to secrete interleukin-2. Interleukin-2 causes the proliferation of certain cytotoxic T cells and B cells. The immune response from this point follows two paths, one using cytotoxic T cells and one using B cells. Normal cells of the body that become infected can also digest some of the pathogens and display antigen fragments on their cell surfaces. The body makes millions of different types of cytotoxic T cells. Each type is able to recognize a particular antigen. The cytotoxic T cells that are capable of recognizing the antigen displayed on the surfaces of infected cells bind to the infected cells and produce chemicals that kill the infected cell. Death of the infected cells results in destruction of the pathogen. These cells also come in millions of different types.
What we showed there was the cellular response with the, and you've got that. I think you showed that
Other picture.
and other picture where the macrophage takes in the antigen or the pathogenic cell, and the receptors then hook up with the T cell, the T4 cell, to identify it, and then in turn produce interleukins 1 and 2 for the cytotoxic cell. And now what you're seeing on the screen now is the T8 cells are multiplying.
And try to do that while generating income at the same time. Some other ecologists have argued that assembly rules are constraints. They act as filters. I mentioned the soil and the germinating of the poison parsnip, for example. If you can't sprout in that kind of soil, whether it's too acidic or too alkaline, too wet, too dry, too much organic matter, not enough organic matter, if you can't sprout in that particular medium, that acts as a filter, and it filters you out of the system. And so a lot of discussion within ecological restoration communities is based around ecological filters. We'll talk quite a bit about filters tonight. And J. Bastow Wilson defined assembly rules as ecological restrictions on the observed patterns of species, the presence or abundance that are based on the presence or abundance of one or more other species or groups of species. How do you like that? Memorize that and say it twice. Assembly rules arise from the interactions between all the living components of a system, and they're also interact with the non-living parts of the system. And I'm just going to zip right through here. Is if we know how plant communities assemble themselves, what conditions they need, we can predict where a given system will go on its own if we leave it alone, and we can figure out if there are certain filters along the way. We can figure out that if this is the major restriction, for example, if the major restriction in an agricultural field is compaction, 8 inches down from a plow pan from being plowed for 60 years, we know that if we remove that filter right there, we can have a whole bunch of different other alternative stable states that can develop out of that. So to identify the filters, we can now identify these leverage points where we can make the least amount of input for the most amount of change. So all this research leads to some of the questions: is do disturbed sites repair themselves and return to their pre-disturbance state, or do historical events along the way produce a variety of alternative stable states? And part of what I showed a bunch of weeks ago, I showed a lot more slides with this. This was Prospect Hill at the Harvard community, I think it's a Harvard Community Forest in Massachusetts, after the hurricane of 1938. It was once upon a time chestnut, oak, hickory that was cleared for settlement. It was farmed for 100 years or so, and then as the soil got played out, because it's thin, rocky soil, it all grew up to pine, went through a phase of grassland, then it went through a phase of blackberries and raspberries and pine, and then all the pines, young pines, blew down in the hurricane of 1938.
And I'll make the note down there that we're going through the orders of permanence. Remember, it's a design guideline and not a hard map. Any good designer, when he's looking at the orders of permanence, slides back and forth and thinks about all the different orders of scale of permanence as you're going through the design. But in general, we tend to design from the most permanent towards the more transient. Okay. And so you think, well, what kinds of transport am I talking about? Since we have the water in the area that we're going to be building out, and we're starting to think about putting in foot trails and these bike paths and electric vehicle paths and so forth. You can do things like solar electric vehicles. You can do the electric assist recumbent trike, which is a really cool piece of technology. That the device in the lower right hand, you can pedal yourself, or you can let it go on battery. And because the whole thing is so light, it's very, very efficient compared to even the most efficient electric cars, which are a couple thousand pounds, and it takes a lot of energy to run a 2,000, 3,000 or more pound vehicle around. These things like the velomobiles and the bicycles, these are some of the most efficient ways of getting around, and for inside of a village, they are so much more humane than having cars running all over the place. They're so much safer, and they're so much more connective. They tend to let people connect with each other so much better. Okay, so That gives us the capability of creating shared green spaces because we're not putting roads everywhere, and we have walking trails and bike trails and low-speed electric vehicle trails that really are much more compatible with shared green spaces. This allows for us to do a lot. Boy, we talked about that quite a bit. What are all the values of shared green spaces for human health and human happiness, for community health, and for the ecological sustainability of your community that you're talking about? You know? So we also want to go and start, as we start laying out now, we've got this idea of the water in the landscape being fixed. We've got the trails and the paths and so forth. Well, we start to need to think about where our clusters of buildings are going to go. So we know where we need to have trails and paths to connect things. But in order to do that, we really would like to create mixed-use, walkable neighborhoods. So that instead of, as we talked about when we talked about zoning, we don't have all the workplaces over here, all the shopping places way over here, and then the houses all over another area, and you can't go anywhere without having to travel a lot. Very disconnected, and requires a huge amount of energy, and burns up a lot of people's time in the day in transit. And what we'd really like to do is see homes, apartments, shops, all clustered for easy walking. And by doing that, we leave wild buffers for recreation and green spaces and so forth.
Change things, duplicate things, copy the map in its entirety, make a sub-map. So, okay, we've got the big mainframe design for what's going on, but now we need to drill down and deal with how we're going to do this one Chinampa in this one area or something like that. You can get GPS coordinates out of my maps. You can use GPS coordinates that you have inside of it fairly easily. You can present alternate versions. But most especially, it's a good picture worth 1,000 words conversation starter if you're dealing with a client, you're dealing with some other contractor like a landscape or an architect person, before you spend a whole lot of time going into expensive heavy CAD tools. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about exactly how to use it. There are great YouTube tutorials out there, and most especially in the lower right-hand corner, apologize for it being a little pixelated, but there's a little question mark. If you right-click on that, you go take a tour. My Maps has pretty good getting started functionality in it. I'll cover some of the main features, but won't spend too much time clicking and showing and that kind of stuff because that's already been done elsewhere. The best thing you can do is just spend time playing with it. Free Jeopardy, you know, how do I do this, clicking with this, because it does have some quirks about left clicking, right clicking, double clicking. So if you want to become very proficient with it, just some free play time works great. The key is starting your My Maps from Google Drive. So you do have to have a Google account. Google gives you a free drive space, 15 gigs, something like that. So plenty of space. The maps don't actually count towards that storage space, so there's no problem there. But you can organize them into folders. You can copy as many as you need. You can print. You can export the PDF. You can do whatever you need to do with the My Maps inside of Google Drive. And there are extra features that you get in My Maps if you start the file, let's call it, from Google Drive. For some reason, if you try to start it from Google Maps itself, you don't get all the drawing tools. I'm not quite sure why that is, but I found the best features, functionality, everything is to just do new, more, Google My Maps, bam, you're into your mapping tool. Inside the tool, there are quite a few different base maps. So we're just going to cover the top three. You see there's 9 of them here.